Hello, everyone. Welcome to Developmental Psychology, DEP 2004. I am Dr. Rivera. Let me first talk a little bit about the different parts. Okay. So, first of all, your neurons have cell bodies, and your cell bodies, they're just cells, the same way that all of your other cells in your body are. There are nucleus, they are filled with cytoplasm, there are vacuoles to get rid of waste, there are mitochondria for energy, there are ribosomes, there's DNA in the nucleus. These are just cells, just like the other cells in your body. But of course, there are some extra parts to a neuron. First of all, there's the nucleus. Uh, Here you have the dendrite. Your dendrites are the antenna that catch the signal being sent from the presynaptic neuron. Presynaptic means before the synapse. So the neuron before the synapse is going to send signals, and these dendrites are going to catch them. If they catch enough of those signals, enough of those chemicals, well, then they're going to send a electrical signal down the axon. Your axon are basically the longest and biggest parts of your neurons. Some axons are small. They go from one part of the brain to another part of the brain right next to it. But some of them can be quite long. And if you see the picture to the right, you can see some axons just coming down the body. Now, what you're seeing there, the reason is they're so clear is because there's a lot of axons sort of wrapped around each other, and those are sort of the bigger nerves. One axon all by itself, you wouldn't be able to see the width of that with your naked eye, but you would be able to see the length of it with your naked eye, especially if we're talking about the axons that begin towards the base of your spinal column all the way down to your fingertips. Those are super long. And the same thing is true with those axons that are towards the base of your spinal cord all the way down to your feet and toes. Those are really long. You also have some other long axons, which are going to include some of your cranial nerves. Your vagus nerve, for example, is very long. Now, you have about 1 million axons per nerve. So what you're seeing there, every little strand there has about 1 million axons wrapped in there. And in fact, you have about 100 billion neurons in your brain and body. Now, you'll notice that there are these little, sometimes sausage-looking things wrapped around the axon, and we call those myelin or myelin sheaths. You're not born with a lot of myelin, but throughout your life, you develop myelin around your axons. And specifically, from the time you're born until you're around 25 years old, you're still wrapping your axons with myelin. Right now, I imagine that most of you are in your late teens and early 20s. You have most of your myelin, but between now to around 25, you'll still have some myelin that you will create and use to wrap around your axons. Sometimes you'll hear people say things like, uh, your brain isn't really developed until you're around 25 years old. And that's true. And one of the reasons why people say this is because of myelin. You won't have all of it until you're around 25. Now, what your myelin does is that it covers up gates that exist all throughout the axon. And these gates open and close and open and close to let ions in and ions out. Basically, by covering up those gates, what the myelin does is it actually makes the impulse, that electrical impulse, move faster through the axon. Think about having a hose in your backyard, and you open up the water for the hose, and the water just kind of drips out. It doesn't come out with a lot of force. But if you put your thumb over the hole there, it will shoot out faster. That's because you're increasing the pressure now. Well, the same thing is happening with this myelin. They cover those gates and they increase the pressure to push that electrical signal out faster through the axon. But sometimes the immune system will actually attack the myelin. Myelin is usually a lipid, it's a fat that gets used in order to cover up the axon. But when the immune system attacks it, it'll actually get replaced with scar tissue. And so it becomes a hard, fibrous tissue, and that is going to disrupt the neuron and the timing of the neuron and is going to create communication problems between the brain and the rest of the body. And what's going to result is that now the communication is off, and so the brain isn't really going to understand what is happening, and the body won't really understand the commands that are being sent by the brain. And this is going to result in things like pain. Sometimes people will feel a tingly sensation. Sometimes people will feel a sensation of electric shock, especially when they move their neck in certain ways. They might have tremors and lack of coordination. And then there's going to be other things that are going to occur, vision problems, dizziness, etc. Now, you'll also notice that the myelin doesn't cover the whole axon. There's still little pieces of axon that are visible or that are not covered. Well, those pieces are important because those gates that open and close are still exposed here. And that's really important because you need them. These exposed pieces of axon we called the nodes of Ranvier. Okay. Now, at the end of your axon, you have what we call axon terminals. And depending on what you're reading on the internet or which book you're reading, there are a handful of names for this part of the neuron. Sometimes they're called axon terminals. Sometimes they're called axon bulbs, terminal buttons, terminal bulbs, or axon terminal bulbs. And it just depends on what you're reading or who's speaking. Those names are interchangeable. Now, the axon terminals are where the chemicals are stored, what we are going to call neurotransmitters in just a little bit. But those chemicals, if you ever heard anybody say, like, oh, the chemicals in their brain weren't balanced or something like that, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about those neurotransmitters, those chemicals that exist inside the terminal buttons or the axon terminals. If an impulse gets all the way down to the axon terminals, then those chemicals will be released. Now, no two neurons ever actually touch. And so if you see the picture here, there is a terminal button and there is what will be the next neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, the neuron that comes after the synapse. And you see that they don't touch. There is a little bit of a gap there. And of course, that gap we call the synapse or the synaptic gap. And this is kind of where the real magic occurs as far as sending signals and controlling signals and what those signals might end up doing. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any questions. And remember that the best way to contact me is directly through Canvas. I hope to hear from you soon.